In the previous video, we used the intuitive example to illustrate how a frictional reserve banking system creates money. Okay? Here, we're going to introduce a formal mathematical expression or model to capture the money supply, okay? Or more specifically, the two determinants of money supply. They are money multiplier and monetary base. Okay? The monetary base, B, is dollars held by the public as currency and by the banks as reserves. Okay? And the monetary base in reality is directly controlled by the Federal Reserve because how much currency is circulating in the economy, the Fed can decide, how much, paper money they want to print, right? And for the bank reserves, because the Federal Reserve can change the reserve requirement. So through that, it can directly affect how much money the banks keep in their offices. Okay. And here we have reserve deposit ratio. Okay. So compared to the deposit, how much these banks reserve. And we have the currency deposit ratio. Okay. So how much money, paper money, is circulating in the economy in comparison to the deposit. All right. So the mathematical derivation here is, let's start with the monetary base. B equals C plus R, currency plus reserves in banks. Okay. And then we have the money supply, which is defined as a sum of currency and deposit, right? So here, what we do is a mathematical trick. We divided these by monetary base and then multiplied by monetary base. So as you can see, these two actually canceled out or could be canceled out, right? However, we're doing this because we want to, plug in the C plus R, okay? Or replace the B with the C plus R. So here it's C currency plus deposit over currency plus reserves times monetary base. All right. Now the second math trick we're doing here is we divided both numerator and denominator by deposit. Okay. Now here the first one on the numerator is C over D. The second one, it's D over D, so it's just number 1, right? In the denominator, it's C over D plus R over D, okay? Now, let me remind you one more time. C over D means currency to deposit ratio, so that is alpha, right? Plus 1 over alpha plus here reserve deposit ratio. Okay, reserve deposit ratio, that's RR, right? So multiplied by monetary base. All right, so here lowercase letter m is used to denote alpha plus 1 over alpha plus RR. This is so-called the money multiplier. Okay, you probably still remember back in chapter 3 we discussed tax cut multiplier, government spending multiplier, right? Here is a third multiplier. It's called money multiplier. Okay. Now, if you look at the left-hand side of this equation, which is money supply, and the far right, it's the money multiplier times monetary base. Okay. Now here, monetary base is a high-powered money. By that we mean it can be used to generate more and more and more money down the road. Okay, and as we said, these are how much money held by the public and the banks. Okay? Now, from this mathematical equation, could you please think about, how the money supply can be raised? Okay. Now here, I strongly encourage you to pause the video and think about this, right? Now, it is obvious that a larger reserve deposit ratio leads to a smaller money multiplier, right? Because the RR gets larger, then the whole denominator gets smaller, right? I'm sorry, gets larger, and then the ratio, the money multiplier becomes smaller, right? So then the money supply decreases. Okay, so there's a negative relationship between the reserve deposit ratio and the overall money supply. Okay, and for alpha, which is a currency deposit ratio, now it appears both in the numerator and denominator. Okay, now you would, by doing the math, you can simply plug in some numbers and you will be able to find that the larger the alpha, the smaller the money supply. All right, so again, it's another negative correlation. Now let's take a look at the Fed, okay, the Federal Reserve. How could they change the money supply? As we already discussed, the Fed has a very strong influence upon the monetary base, okay, because they would decide how much money they want to print, and then by using the new money, they can purchase the treasury bonds and bills, right? And but they cannot directly change money supply, especially the money multiplier. Okay? In other words, the Fed's influence upon money supply is indirect. It happens through its influence upon the monetary base. Okay? So, of course, as we said, this depends upon the money multiplier. Okay? A very important conclusion we could draw here is the Federal Reserve cannot completely control the money supply. Okay. Now, of course, in reality, when we talk about money supply, we keep talking about the Federal Reserve, so that we were under the impression that the Fed has an absolute say about the money supply. Okay, absolute control over it. But that is not true. The Fed has a much stronger or direct control over monetary base, but not money multiplier or the money supply. Okay. Now here, let's use the Great Depression as a quick example. Okay. We know that this is the worst financial crisis in human history. Okay. And there are many different lessons we learn from that crisis. Okay? But one important among them, one which is closely related to the monetary policy is, back then, the Federal Reserve or the central bank did not respond properly and actively. Okay? Back then, people sort of believed that you guys messed up, you produced a lot, for example, and so we're not gonna bail anybody out. Okay, now because of that, people start worrying about the money, how safe their money is at these banks. Okay, so we find some of them start withdraw the money, which created a huge, the massive panic in the country. So people, run to the local banks and withdraw their money. This is so-called a bank run. Okay, and that's why here, as you can see, this line, the from 1929 to 1933, people held much more currency. Okay. and but the bank reserve actually decreased a lot. This decrease is not just because of the reserve deposit ratio. It's actually because people put less money into the banks. Okay? All right, and so if you just look at the monetary base, you find that it's actually increasing over the course of 4 years. However, during the same period, the money multiplier actually decreased from 3.7 to 2.3. Okay? Once again, that's because both RR and alpha decreased. Okay? Increased. So the reserve deposit ratio increased from 0.14 to 0.21, and currency deposit ratio increased from 0.17 to 0.41. Okay. Now, as we said, there's a negative correlation between these two ratios and the money multiplier, right? So when both get larger, the money multiplier is actually decreasing. It gets smaller. Okay? And that's why even the monetary base increased, but overall money supply actually decreased a lot. Okay, as you can see, from 26.5 to 19. And these actually make the Great Depression even more devastating. Okay, this is a very important lesson the monetary policy makers learn from Great Depression. Okay, if they didn't really bail out, they didn't actively increase the money supply, especially monetary base, then we're going to end up with a smaller money supply that could hurt the economic recovery a lot. Okay, because when money supply decreased, that means the firms, especially the mid-sized or small businesses, would get hurt a lot. Okay, they probably have a hard time, receiving the loans and making investment. All right. And here, let's take a look at the more recent data. Okay, what I'm pulling out at the top is a monetary base. Okay, and the bottom is M2, which is very popular measure of money supply. Right. When we look at the monetary base, we find that as we said before, 3 phases of QE, and even this year, 2020, a huge increase in amount of money printed, the new money printed. However, when we look at the M2, you may find that but at least before this year, M2 was much smoother than monetary base. Okay, again, the reason is because of the change in money multiplier. Oftentimes, when we increase the monetary base, you find that the money multiplier would decrease. Okay, so they partially offset with each other, and eventually the M2 becomes more stable. Okay, more smooth. However, when we look at this year, because of the pandemic, the monetary base increased again from the mid 3 to no 5. There's a huge increase, more than $1.5 trillion new money have been printed and pumped into the economy. Okay, and we find that the M2 also increased this time. Okay, again, this is very amazing because we never see this kind of the jump, big jump of M2 happened before. Okay, so that may suggest something is probably happening to the money multiplier. Okay, at least different from what we know before. Okay, now here is the growth rate or the percentage change from a year ago. Again, you can figure out the difference between these two. So monetary base fluctuates a lot. Okay, so for example, here the growth rate is even over 100%, but the M2 is much more